The Civil War is a huge topic, and we can only scratch the surface here. But we're going to do that in three parts, three different PowerPoints, and this is the first of those three. Um, let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of the two sides in the Civil War. The Union, or the North, had some important advantages. They had more population, a lot more, about 22 million to 9 million. And of those 9 million in the South, only about 5 million were potentially available to fight because most of the rest were slaves. The North had more railroads, more factories, both very important in wartime. They had a more reliable food supply, especially thanks to the McCormick Reaper. They had a stronger central government, which is important in war. A government needs to raise taxes to coordinate the movements of large numbers of troops, of lots of war materials, and the South was against a strong central government. And when they decided that they would have a weaker government in their constitution, they were handicapping themselves to a certain extent. Also, the North did not have to fight in their homeland for the most part. There were a few battles in the North, but most of the battles, by far, were fought in the South. And a lot of those slaves that the South was relying on for labor escaped, and some of them became laborers who aided the North. Now, the Confederacy, the South, had advantages as well, though. They had mostly better generals. The best example of that is Robert E. Lee. And they only had to defend their home territory, not attack far away as the North did. This seemed to be an advantage in the beginning, although it never panned out for the South. But they had some hope of getting support from the British because the British had relied so much on Southern cotton. We'll see later why that didn't work. But this is important. The South needed only a tie to win. Their goal was not to conquer the North. Their goal was simply to break away from the North and to become their own country. And in order to do this, they simply needed to create a government and keep the North out of their country, and rather than having to invade the North. They did invade a couple of times, but not because they needed to achieve their basic goal in the war. They did that to try to put pressure on the North. The situation that Robert E. Lee faced in the beginning of the war is very interesting. He was invited by Lincoln to command Union troops. Everybody knew that he was an extremely talented general. And originally, too, Lee was not a big supporter of secession. He wasn't one of the more radical Southerners, but he decided that he could not go against his country. That's the word that he used. But by country, he meant Virginia. And ironically, one of the effects of the Civil War is to change people's ideas of what the country was. We think of ourselves not as Michiganians, for example. We think of ourselves more as Americans. And that is to some degree a result of this war. Now, the first major battle of the war was fought only about 20 or 25 miles from Washington, D.C., from the nation's capital, at a place called near Manassas Creek, near the town of Manassas, at the creek called Bull Run. And both sides really were confident going in. The North thought this would be a short war, and there were actually Northerners from Washington who journeyed down to the battlefield, and they brought picnic lunches. They thought, well, we'll just watch, our boys whip those rebels, and the war will be over by nightfall, with absolutely no idea that this would be a 4-year nightmare. The South, partway through the battle, and partly due to the heroics of Stonewall Jackson, turned the tide of battle, and the inexperienced Union troops were scattered and simply were routed. And the city of Washington itself was left very poorly defended, and they were lucky that that they didn't lose their capital. Um, a lot of early battles went badly for the North. They replaced the old General Winfield Scott with a young, talented general by the name of George McClellan. He was excellent at training troops and organizing an army. He was not, however, excellent at fighting. He didn't want to risk this marvelous army that he had created. Um, Lincoln went through a whole series of generals that we won't deal with now, but it was only much later in the war that he came upon the general who would win it for him, and that, of course, was Ulysses Grant. This is a map that you can go back to on the PDF version of this and get a sense of where the Civil War was fought. You don't need to know all of this, but you'll notice that a lot of battles were fought in Virginia. Many were fought in Tennessee, and there was an eastern front and a western front. And a lot of the Union's efforts were more successful in the west than they were in the east. But the Confederate capital was at Richmond, and the North was not going to win the war until they had defeated the main Confederate armies, and that meant winning in Virginia, and they found that to be very difficult. Early in the war, the issue came up in the North, what they would do with slaves who escaped to Union lines. There was no real federal policy at first. They hadn't worked it out. They left the decision up to each battlefield commander as to how to handle this situation. General Benjamin Butler in Virginia said that escaped slaves were contraband of war. That means advantages, assets, like weapons that the other side had in war. And if you capture these, you deprive the enemy of them. So you admit them to Union lines because they had been used to help build Confederate defenses. Therefore, they were a tool of war. But some Union commanders very early even wanted to return fugitive slaves to the South. Their point was that this is not a war to end slavery. And Lincoln had made that clear. At first, it was not, because there were 4 slave states that were still part of the Union. And the danger was that if you made it a war to end slavery, you would offend and lose the support of a lot of Northerners in those northern slave states, namely Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. A law was passed by Congress in August of 1861, just a few months into the war, and Congress decided that any escaped slaves who had been used by their owners to aid the rebellion would be free forever. It's called the Confiscation Act. But and this part is really not a very pleasant story. Camps were established, and even though they were no longer slaves, these former slaves were not really free either. They were hired out to loyal planters, and they were paid something, but not very much, or they were simply put to work by the Union Army. And in some camps, as many as 25% of those who lived there died due to the very poor conditions. So this was obviously not a good situation at all. This is an early photograph of escaped slaves fording the Rappahannock River in 1862, looking to gain freedom by escaping to Union lines.